The thing that finally got me moving wasn't the footsteps, it was how careful they were. I was kneeling in the vestibule of my tent with one glove half on, trying not to make the zipper chatter, and outside I could hear somebody walking a slow circle around my campsite like they were checking spacing. Just one set of steps at first. Crunch pause, not wandering, not somebody lost, measured, like they already knew exactly where my client was and were making sure I knew they knew too. Every time I started to unzip the flap, the sound stopped, not faded, not moved off, just stopped. The freezing air kept slipping in through the seams and hitting my face. And above all of it, there was that metallic clacking dead branches make when wind knocks them together overhead. If you've hiked up around Lost Creek in the cold months, you know the sound. It doesn't even register after a while. It becomes part of the place. But that night, every branch strike sounded like a signal. I remember holding my breath so long my chest hurt, then hearing it again, farther around the backside of the tent, then nothing. And when I finally cracked the vestibule open and looked out, there was a second tent shape sitting in the dark less than 20 feet away, where I knew for a fact there hadn't been one before. A few months before that, I decided I was going to do what I always told myself I'd do more often, which was a simple solo overnight before the season really started. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't through hiking or doing some survival thing. I just wanted to test new winter gear without finding out the hard way on a longer spring trip that I'd wasted money on a sleeping pad that sounded good online and turned into a cold sponge after midnight. I'm pretty comfortable alone outdoors. More than comfortable, honestly. I like how simple it gets when it's just you and whatever you remembered to pack. I keep old topo maps folded in gallon freezer bags, and I write mileage notes in the margins by hand because I don't trust hiking apps anymore. I lost service once during a wildfire evacuation and spent the better part of an afternoon swearing at a blue dot that kept deciding I was in a lake. So now I make notes the old way. Trail junctions, water sources, weird little landmarks, all of it. That weekend I was wearing this faded green fleece I'd had since college, the elbows shiny from years of backpack straps rubbing the same spots. I had store-brand instant coffee packets because I forgot to buy the good ones. I also brought a new stove that, of course, still had the giant safety sticker half peeled off, because apparently I only finish tasks halfway when they're boring. So it was not some grim survival expedition. It was me on purpose taking a routine overnight out near Goose Creek's trailhead to test gear and get out of my apartment for once. The trail was quiet in that winter way where sound seems too sharp. I could smell pine sap every time the sun hit one side of the corridor, and the wind came through the granite gaps hard enough that it cut through my shell jacket at the shoulders. Somewhere off in the trees, a woodpecker kept knocking away, except the echo between the rocks made it sound like it was moving faster than it should have been. Tap here, then there, then almost behind me. I remember laughing to myself and saying, "Okay, show off." The first thing that bugged me should have bugged me more. There was a stretch where the trail markers looked freshly repainted, bright, clean color. No weathering, no dirt film, nothing. They stood out so much against the older wood and stone that I stopped and checked my map case. A couple of them weren't where I had notes saying they'd be. Not way off, just enough that I noticed. My first thought was maintenance crews. The area had closures and work going on off and on. People update markers. That happens. Still it felt off. Officially the stretch had been closed for maintenance, or at least partly restricted depending on the week. And these weren't just new. They looked almost too new, like they had gone up an hour before I got there. I told myself I was being precious about map accuracy because I keep notes like some weird little trail accountant. A bit later, I saw boot prints in the snow crossing the trail ahead of me. Normal enough, except they crossed straight over untouched snow with no approach tracks leading into them that I could see. Just the prints themselves cutting across. I stood there longer than I want to admit, kind of squinting like a better angle would fix it. Then I decided wind drift must have erased the earlier part. Snow does weird things, everybody knows that. I even said it out loud just to hear a normal explanation in a human voice, so I kept going. And that's the part I still kick myself for, because by then I had enough little things to turn around. I just didn't want to. I had that trip planned for weeks. I'd packed, checked weather, moved stuff around at work, told people I was finally getting out there. The dumbest reason in the world to ignore your instincts is embarrassment, but that's a real one. I didn't want to be the person who bailed over trail markers and weird footprints, and then had to explain to my friends that, no, actually nothing happened. I just got spooked by vibes. I reached the designated campsite in the late afternoon, just as the light was going flat and cold. There was already a tarp there neatly folded and weighted at the corners with 4 fist-sized stones. Not spread, not pitched, just folded like someone intended to come right back to it. No pack, no stove, no person. I called out once, then a second time, just normal trail etiquette. Anybody here? The only answer was a whistle farther uphill. Not close, not loud. Just a whistle that came down through the trees and then bent weird off the rocks. I waited maybe 5 seconds listening, and it came again, slightly different timing. Now anyone who's spent enough time around rock formations is probably already ahead of me here in saying echo. And maybe it was. But the second one felt wrong in a way I can't make sound scientific. It didn't sound like the first whistle bouncing back. It sounded like another person trying to do the same whistle half a beat later. I stood there with one trekking pole in my hand and my pack hanging off one shoulder, thinking, okay, if this is somebody's site, they probably went uphill to pee or collect water or whatever. The tarp means somebody's here. The whistle means somebody heard me. End of mystery. So I set up anyway, not on top of the tarp, off to one side. Far enough to be polite, close enough that if someone came back, we could have that awkward trail conversation, where everybody smiles too much and says no worries when they definitely are worrying. The rest of the evening felt normal in pieces. I made noodles that tasted like salty cardboard. I wrote down mileage in my map. I noticed one of my socks had picked up a burr somehow, even though it was winter, which felt rude on nature's part. The wind kept threading through the granite and rattling branches high above, and every so often the woodpecker sound came back in the distance. No one came for the tarp. By full dark, I told myself there were a dozen explanations. Someone hunting, someone day hiking late, someone who had stashed gear and decided to camp elsewhere. Weird, but not emergency weird. Then I heard somebody walking around my tent. At first I thought animal. The gait was wrong though, too stop-start, too deliberate. Snow compresses differently under boots than paws, and if you hike enough, you learn that without trying. This was a person. One full loop, not rushing, not sneaking exactly, because that would sounded lighter. This sounded like someone not caring whether I heard them. I froze for a second, then grabbed my headlamp and called out, "Hey, nothing." I unzipped the vestibule fast enough to snag the fabric and had to yank it loose. No light, no person. Just my little patch of camp, my stove, my boots, and darkness pushing up against the trees. I kept the lamp sweeping for way too long, then finally got back inside because standing there lit up in the open felt even dumber. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time on the downhill side. Crunch. Pause, I said. Seriously, who's there? Nothing. Same thing. The minute I touched the zipper, silence. I started trying to reason it out in real time. Another camper messing with me. Somebody drunk. Somebody looking for their own site and being weird about headlamps. It wasn't impossible. That's what kept me from packing up right then. Every explanation was bad, but none of them were impossible. Around midnight, after hours of that on and off, I finally worked up the nerve to look again. That's when I saw the second tent. It wasn't lit from inside. It was just a darker shape against dark, low, and angular, less than 20 feet away through the trees where I knew there had been empty ground. I had cooked facing that direction. I had peed facing that direction. I had checked that exact patch with my headlamp earlier. Nothing was there, and now there was. I didn't go out. No chance. I sat there with my knees pulled up inside my sleeping bag and listened so hard my ears hurt. Once I heard what sounded like fabric shifting. Once a low cough, maybe. Or a branch rubbing. I don't know. I know how that sounds. I just know there had not been a tent there, and then there was. I waited for morning and never really got it. Just that gray pre-dawn where the dark loosens a little. I broke camp almost blind. Left half my stuff, left the stove. Left the pad I'd gone out there to test. I stuffed my map case, keys, wallet, water, and jacket into my pack and didn't even try to be quiet. At that point, I wanted noise. I wanted it known I was leaving. The second tent was gone. No stakes, no tracks I could make sense of. Just flattened snow and a patch of darker shadow where I thought it had been. I didn't look at the tarp site. I didn't call out. I started downhill. The whole descent I could hear footsteps off the trail behind the tree line. Not gaining, not falling back, matching me. If I slowed, they slowed. If I sped up, somewhere out there the pace changed too. I kept telling myself it was my own movement echoing weird through the corridor, or chunks of snow dropping late from branches, or anything else. But then I'd stop dead, and one step would come after. Then another. I hit a switchback where the trees opened just enough uphill that I finally saw him. He was standing above the trail, maybe 30 feet away, perfectly still. White winter camouflage, the cheap kind that's too bright against real snow, stained dark at both knees like he'd been kneeling in mud or old blood or wet bark, I don't know. Face covered, hood up. He didn't step toward me. He raised one gloved hand slowly and pointed behind me, down the trail I'd just come from. Not at me, past me. That was the moment my body made the decision before my brain did. Everything in me just dropped straight through. My hands stopped working right. I couldn't get a full breath. I turned and ran. I'm not proud of that being the first truly smart choice I made, but there it is. The last half mile to the trailhead was just noise and slipping and branches whipping my sleeves. I kept waiting to hear somebody crashing after me on the trail. Instead, I thought I heard movement paralleling me off to the side, then nothing, then movement again. At one point, I almost went down hard on a patch of packed snow and caught myself on a tree with both palms so hard the bark tore skin through my gloves. When I reached the parking lot, my driver's side door was hanging open. Not wide, just enough to see it from a distance and feel my stomach bottom out. I know I locked it. I am annoyingly, embarrassingly meticulous about that kind of thing, especially solo. My map case was gone from the front seat. That's what hit first. Not my emergency cache, not the older camera I keep in the console, not anything valuable by normal standards. Just my paper maps. The glove box had been opened and shut again. Nothing else taken. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine so fast I almost flooded it. It wasn't until I hit pavement and the truck started pulling weird that I realized the front tire was nearly flat. When I finally stopped at a gas station with actual lights and other people around, I found punctures in it. More than one. I reported it. I did all the normal adult things you're supposed to do after something like that. Sheriff, ranger district, statements, descriptions, the whole deal. I even drove back later with an officer to the lot, but by then, weather and time had already erased whatever might have been useful. Nobody had a good answer for the trail markers either. Nobody admitted to repainting them. I never got my maps back. The gear I left at that campsite stayed there. I didn't want any of it. I kept the damaged map case after it eventually turned up in a lost and found bin miles away, which makes no sense either. But I threw away the rest of the stuff from that trip when I replaced it. My brain had decided it all belonged to that night, and I don't hike alone in snow anymore. That's the actual aftermath, not some dramatic lesson. I still hike. I still camp. I still write stupid little mileage notes in old topo maps like a grandmother preserving recipes. But silence in snow used to feel like the best part to me. Now it feels like concealment. Like the landscape is helping somebody stay hidden. What I still can't get past is that man on the switchback, because if he meant to come down to my camp, he had all night to do it. And if he was warning me, then he was warning me about something that had already been behind me on the trail. Story break. The next one comes from somebody who spent long enough in the woods that the wrongness stopped looking accidental. Story 2. By the time I understood I should walked away from that contract, I'd already spent a season teaching myself not to look too closely at certain things. That sounds worse than I mean it, although maybe not by much. I was on an informal patrol route off the Timberline Spur near Klamath, doing seasonal enforcement and maintenance documentation. That's the tidy version. The less tidy version is that contractors like me were the people sent to look at the stuff agencies didn't have enough bodies or political appetite to deal with directly. Illegal camps, dumped trash, grow sites, access damage, that kind of thing. You document, report, keep your distance unless things go bad, and try not to make extra work for anyone higher up the chain. The dry air up there always carried old smoke in it, even outside fire season. Not active fire, just residue like the whole place had been singed years ago and never fully aired out. You'd open a truck door and brittle dust would lift off the floor mat. Empty fire roads had this powder on them that got inside your nose and teeth. Every sound traveled weird. Sometimes you'd hear a chainsaw way off and it seemed both close and nowhere. I used to keep old ranger patches sewn inside my backpack, not on the outside where anybody could see them, inside, under the flap. Little private guilt museum. I didn't feel like I'd earned them anymore, not after a while. At the beginning, though, I still told myself I was doing useful work. The first suspicious camps I found were easy to explain. Restricted zones get used anyway. People know back routes. Some camps get broken down fast when they hear vehicles coming. I'd roll up and find warm ash, a cut piece of paracord still swinging, tire marks not yet softened, and think, okay, they heard me. End of story. What I didn't say out loud then was that aggressive enforcement stats made renewals easier. If you documented enough incidents, there was justification for more seasonal money, more contracts, more work next year. So when I started noticing camps that seemed to be evacuated minutes before arrival, I didn't exactly rush to make a big moral stand about it. I let it sit. Better numbers later if the pattern kept going. That's the part I own. I drove a white fleet truck with a passenger door that only opened from the inside if you hit it with your shoulder just right. I kept stale peanut butter crackers in the center console and drank terrible gas station coffee from a steel mug that always tasted faintly like soap. My pack smelled like canvas, dust, and old smoke. Most mornings started before first light with me scribbling route notes on a clipboard and checking that the spare radio battery was actually charged, which it usually wasn't because nothing in government-adjacent work is ever actually charged when it should be. The first hard wrong note came out of a burned ranger cabin that was supposed to have collapsed years earlier. What was left of it was barely a shell. Charred framing, half a wall, roofing metal twisted back like open cans. I went in because I saw a fresh tire sign on an access spur that shouldn't have had anything recent on it. Inside, stacked neatly on an old counter blackened by fire, were canned foods. Soup, beans, peaches, all labels outward like a store display. Fresh enough that dust hadn't settled on the tops yet. I remembered standing there with my pen still uncapped, staring like the arrangement itself was the weirdest part, which maybe it was. If you've ever come across actual desperate living conditions in the woods, neatness is not usually the first thing you notice. This looked intentional. Presented. I wrote it up as possible squatter activity and kept moving. Over the next couple weeks, I started finding unofficial camps repeatedly cleared and reused deep inside restricted zones. Fire rings cold but tidy, trash bagged, bedding gone, ground swept almost. Not clean exactly, but reset, like a room after checkout. One site had a weatherproof notebook tucked inside an ammo can. That notebook is where things shifted. At first, I thought it was a supply log. Dates, notes, abbreviations. Then I started seeing vehicle plates, permit numbers, trailhead references. Some were clearly hiker permits, some were day-use passes. A few entries had dates written again later in different ink, circled, weeks later. I sat there on an overturned bucket, going back through pages trying to make it make sense. Maybe somebody obsessive tracking traffic. Maybe poachers. Maybe grow crews watching for movement. All of those were plausible enough to keep me from jumping straight to something worse. But there were too many ordinary people in that book. Families, retirees, weekend hikers. You could tell from the permit styles and notes, nothing about it read like someone tracking threats. It read like someone keeping tabs. I reported it. Officially, I did the correct thing. Bagged it, radioed it, handed it over. Unofficially, what I remember most is how fast the notebook disappeared once I got back. Supervisor takes it, thanks me, says he'll handle chain of custody, and then no incident number appears. No follow-up request, no mention in the next briefing. When I asked, he said they were probably old records used by volunteer groups, and I was reading too much into it. Maybe I would have let that explanation stick if other things hadn't started lining up around it. A few days later, there was a missing hiker operation not far from the same region. Volunteer crews were assembling, radios crackling, maps out on hoods, the usual tension. Then, almost as quickly, a big chunk of the volunteer search presence pulled back, quietly. No announcement to everyone. Just trucks leaving in pairs. People suddenly told they weren't needed on that section. I asked one of the coordinators what changed. He said plans shift. Around then, I started hearing helicopters overhead through the smoke haze without ever seeing them. Not once or twice, repeatedly. Thudding rotor noise swallowed by the haze, gone before you could get a visual. Anybody who's worked around fire country hears aircraft all the time, so on paper that means nothing. In context, it felt like being watched through a ceiling. I began noticing identical tarp structures in different locations that they should not have been able to move between overnight. Same dark green tarp, same knot pattern, same cheap propane heater model, same stripped food packaging, all labels peeled off the same way. One campsite on an old access road. Another the next morning, many miles away over terrain. Nobody was hauling that exact setup across in the dark just for fun. Then another 2 days later. If you work outdoors long enough, patterns either keep you alive or make you crazy. The problem is both feel the same at first. I started taking private notes. Not report notes, personal ones. Coordinates, timestamps, vehicle descriptions, radio chatter that sounded off. I copied things down because by then I no longer trusted that reporting up the line meant preserving anything. And look, I know what you're probably thinking. Why didn't I just go to the sheriff or press or somebody? The answer is boring and bad. Contract people, live season to season. You tell yourself you need something more solid first. You tell yourself maybe you're combining unrelated stuff into one ugly shape because you're tired and breathing smoke all day. You tell yourself the people above you have context you don't. That's how you stay in a bad situation, long after your instincts have finished voting. The day I really stopped believing it was random, I was checking a route after dawn and saw 2 unmarked utility trucks in a clearing that should been empty. No agency logos. No obvious company marks, just bland trucks that could belong to anybody if you didn't look too hard. There were uniformed personnel at the road approach, not exactly blocking it with weapons drawn or anything dramatic, just standing in a way that made the road stop being public, calm, deliberate, professional enough to make you feel stupid for asking questions. I parked where I had to and got out with my clipboard, because sometimes paperwork gets you closer than confrontation. In the clearing, workers were loading coolers and plastic bins into the trucks. White coolers, gray bins, standard stuff. Except off to one side I saw a stack of hiking packs, a lot of them, piled near a tarp line. One of the workers looked up, recognized me, and immediately threw a tarp over them. Not casually, fast. You can feel a whole reality change in 1 second and still not have a thing you can prove. That's what that was. My mouth went dry so fast I couldn't swallow right. I said something bland, route access question, maintenance inquiry, I don't remember. One of the uniformed guys told me the area was temporarily restricted. Another said they'd follow up through the proper channels. Nobody answered what was in the bins. Nobody answered why there were packs. And nobody needed to tell me to leave twice. After that, I started asking about recovered backpacks that showed up in logs without public missing person notices attached. Carefully at first, then less carefully. That was apparently the point where I became more trouble than useful. I got pulled off patrol and reassigned to work farther out on routine maintenance checks, which is career language for stop digging. So I resigned, not loudly, no grand exit. No righteous speech in a parking lot. I copied radio logs and map coordinates onto personal drives, cleared my locker, took my old mug and left. Incomplete exit is probably the neat phrase for it. It didn't feel like escape. It felt like being removed from a room after seeing the wrong file on a desk. I still have those coordinates. Locked in a toolbox in my garage under a tray of sockets and junk screws. Never shown anyone. I've taken the paper out more than once, and then put it back because every path after that seemed like a choice I couldn't undo. People ask why I don't hike remote federal land anymore, and I usually make a joke about bad knees or smoke seasons. The real answer is every abandoned campsite looks staged to me now. Every neat little unauthorized setup feels less like somebody roughing it and more like a waiting room. I think about the notebook a lot. Plates, permits, dates circled weeks later. I think about volunteer search crews getting pulled with no real explanation. I think about identical camps springing up across impossible distances like copies laid over a map. And I think about that worker covering the pile of confiscated packs before he covered anything else. Maybe it was criminal. Maybe it was unofficial surveillance dressed up as enforcement. Maybe it was a dozen ugly systems overlapping in one place until nobody inside it could see the whole thing anymore. Or maybe it was something bigger that knew exactly how to look routine from far enough away. Story break. This next one is quieter, which honestly made it hit harder for me. Story 3. The first thing I saw when I opened the cabin door was a pair of muddy boots drying by the wood stove. Not near the door like somebody had just stepped in. Set properly by the stove, angled out, laces loosened the way my brother used to leave his. Mud flaked off around them onto the old rug with the bare pattern that's supposed to be brown but has faded into this sad orange color over the years. I actually smiled for a second because my brain grabbed the easiest answer first. One of my uncles must have used the place and forgotten to mention it. Somebody was helping us out. Somebody had already started airing the place before I got there. Then I stood still another few seconds and realized the stove was cold. The air inside had that mildew smell old blankets get when a place stays shut too long, and cold creek air kept sneaking in through the warped window frames in little ribbons. Nothing about it said someone had just been there, but the boots were wet enough at the soles to darken the rug. That cabin had belonged to my family longer than I've been alive. Near the Pisgah boundary, tucked far enough off the road that the quiet always felt heavier there than it should've. My dad wanted it sold after his stroke because nobody was using it anymore, and because I think every object inside reminded him of Tevin. Tevin was my older brother. He disappeared 3 years earlier, not at the cabin officially, not exactly, but that place was threaded through every story about him, because he knew those woods better than anybody in our family, and spent more time there than he did at home during some stretches. After he vanished, the cabin kind of froze in time around him. His old field jacket still on the peg, a dented metal mug on the shelf. The cheap pocket knife he used for opening cans missing from the drawer where it should have been. I was there alone because my dad couldn't travel. My mom wasn't in the picture, and the rest of my family does that thing families do where everyone offers moral support from 2 counties away. I don't like being alone in places like that. Never have. I sleep with lights on in hotel rooms if the curtains are weird. But somebody had to sort the cabin for sale, and I was the one who could take a few days off. I carried Tevin's cracked compass clipped to my bag. It doesn't point north-right anymore. It kind of wanders and settles where it feels like, which would have made him laugh because he loved gear and hated junk gear. And now the one thing of his I always carry is broken. But I kept it anyway, habit maybe. I had a duffel with old sweatshirts, my dad's ring of cabin keys with a faded fish keychain, a bag of grocery store cinnamon rolls, and one of those giant plastic tubs for sorting papers. Real glamorous haunted return stuff outside someone had stacked fresh firewood by the porch. Not a full cord or anything. Just a neat shoulder-high stack under the overhang, recent enough that the cut ends were still bright. Nobody in my family admitted to doing it. I called my aunt, then my cousin. Same answer. Wasn't them. Hadn't been up there in months. I told myself maybe a neighbor. Maybe Dad forgot. Maybe I forgot being told. The whole first day was just cleaning around memories. Shaking out blankets that smelled like damp dust. Finding old deer camp Polaroids curled at the edges. Wiping down counters with lemon cleaner that did absolutely nothing except make mildew smell like mildew with a citrus top note. And I kept noticing little things that were slightly off. Family photos on the wall shifted. Not different photos, just the same ones at new angles. A picture of my dad and Tevin holding trout had been moved from straight over the table to a little left. A photo of me at about 12 in a jacket, way too big for me, had been turned so the frame corner sat against the knot in the wood paneling instead of below it. Not enough that anyone else would have cared. Enough that I knew somebody had touched them. Late that afternoon, I found myself fussing with the boots again, trying to decide whether I recognized them. They were close enough to Tevin's size that I hated even thinking it. Muddy brown leather, cracked at the toe, ordinary in every way. I should say this clearly because it matters. I did not think my missing brother had secretly come home and was hiding nearby. Not then. Grief makes you weird, but not that weird. I thought somebody was using the cabin. That was all. Night at that place always made the dog barks carry farther than seemed possible. There were farms and homes scattered across the valleys, and after dark every dog sounded like it was standing just outside. Add creek air slipping through the windows, and the old timbers popping as the temperature dropped, and you've got enough noise to spook yourself for free. Around midnight, I heard a soft tap on one exterior wall, not a branch, too singular, just tap. I froze with my blanket pulled up under my chin and waited. Nothing. I got up, checked the locks, told myself animal. 3 seconds after I locked the front door again, there was another tap, same wall. I stood there with my hand still on the knob and counted without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Tap. I actually laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the timing was so clean it felt fake. I said, out loud, local teenagers, congratulations, you are the least busy people in North Carolina. That became my explanation for a while. Teenagers. Somebody knew the cabin sat empty. Somebody wanted to mess with whoever came up. The next morning I started sorting canned goods in the kitchen. Some had rust, some didn't. A few were already open in a way that stopped me cold. Tevin used to pop a pocket knife under the rim and peel lids back halfway instead of using the opener if he was being impatient. It bent the metal in this specific ugly way. 2 cans in the pantry had been opened exactly like that. I turned them over in my hands like that would somehow tell me who did it. Still, I held the line on my own explanation. Some man using the cabin. Maybe somebody who'd known my brother. Maybe someone copying habits because everybody around there learns the same tricks. Then I found the crawl space. There was a shallow panel in the hall closet floor I'd never noticed because it was under old paint cans and a broken lantern. When I moved everything to sweep, the edge lifted. Under it was a narrow crawl space with plastic bins shoved back into the dark. Inside were receipts dated only weeks earlier. Batteries, jerky wrappers, water purification tablets, trail maps. Those maps had circles marked around old search grid zones from when people looked for Tevin. I sat down right there on the floor. You know that numb feeling when your body is still receiving information but your mind has hit capacity. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't crying. I was just looking at those circles and thinking, no, 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 but in this flat little voice inside my head that didn't feel like me. A rational explanation still existed. Some local obsessed with the disappearance. Some sick person following the case. Somebody using abandoned search maps because they were already there. All ugly, all possible. That night it rained lightly for an hour, then stopped. The cabin smelled even wetter after. I turned on 2 lamps and kept the television volume up low, even though it only got 3 channels and one of them was snow. I remember eating stale cinnamon rolls straight from the plastic with my shoes still on, because I had this feeling I might need to move fast, even though I couldn't have said why. Sometime after midnight, I heard whistling outside. 3 notes. Tevin had a little 3-note tune he used on hikes when he wanted me to answer back without shouting. It wasn't a song, just 3 notes, rising a little at the end. He did it for years. Muscle memory, family shorthand. I heard it once from outside the cabin, everything in me locked up. My throat went tight so fast I couldn't get air for a second. Then I went to the window and said his name. Tevin, the whistle stopped immediately. No brush noise, no footstep, just stopped. I stayed at the window for I don't know how long, staring into black trees and my own reflection. At some point I realized I was holding the cracked compass so hard it had dug into my palm through my sleeve. The next morning I went uphill behind the cabin, because there was an old shed up there, half collapsed, not really useful for anything anymore. I don't know if I was looking for proof or trying to kill the idea before it got bigger. Maybe both. Inside the shed was a fresh sleeping area, not fancy, just recent. Blankets. A crate turned on its side. Food wrappers. A place someone had been lying down recently enough that the impression still held. I did not search deeper. I didn't start opening bags or calling out or checking the woods around it. People always ask that, and I get it, but no. I had reached the edge of what I could emotionally survive alone. I went back to the cabin shaking, and while I was packing my duffel, something slid from inside one of the trail maps on the table. A photograph. It was me unloading boxes from my car at the cabin that afternoon. Same jacket, same plastic tub. Taken from the tree line, you could see the angle. You could see I was being watched before I ever knew I was there with someone else. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, it said, "You shouldn't stay after dark here either." That was the peak of it. Not a scream, not a chase, not somebody bursting through a door. Just me standing in that kitchen with mildew in the blankets and creek cold coming through the walls, looking at a photo of myself taken hours earlier by somebody close enough to read the labels on my boxes. I left before sunrise the next morning. Didn't wait for full light. I threw things into the car any which way, left half the cleaning supplies, and drove out while the valley was still gray. I refused to go back even to handle the sale. Other relatives and a local attorney did the rest, cowardly. Maybe. Fine, I'll take it. I also made a choice I don't know how to live with cleanly, and that's this. I did not tell my father about the photograph. He was recovering then. Slow, frustrating recovery. And there is a kind of hope that does not heal people. It ruins them. If I had shown him that picture, if I had said maybe Tevin was there, maybe he wasn't dead, maybe, it would have eaten what grief had left him. I couldn't do it. So I lied by omission and let him keep mourning in the shape he already knew. After that weekend, I stopped referring to Tevin as dead. Quietly. I didn't make some announcement. I just stopped using the word. But I also stopped searching publicly. I didn't call newspapers. I didn't restart volunteer efforts. I didn't hand the photo to everybody I knew and demand answers. Part of me couldn't bear being wrong. Part of me couldn't bear being right. I keep the photograph tucked inside the cracked compass case now, folded where nobody accidentally sees it. And I still can't decide what truth is actually worse. That my brother stayed hidden all those years on purpose, close enough to watch me unload boxes and hear me say his name, or that somebody else was using the cabin and knew him well enough to imitate the only whistle I would have answered. Story break. The next account starts in the middle of it, because that's apparently how it felt to live through. Story 4. Somebody was dragging metal across my tailgate for the third time when I realized I had to stop pretending this was a prank. Not loud exactly, slow. A scraping pull from one end of the truck to the other, then a pause, then one solid tap on the driver's side window. Just one. I was sitting behind the wheel with the engine off, keys in my coat pocket instead of the ignition, because I didn't want interior lights flaring on by accident. The fog outside was thick enough that my mirrors were basically gray paper. Condensation had formed inside the truck windows and turned every reflection into a blur. My knees were jammed against the steering column, because I was trying not to move more than necessary, which at my age is a ridiculous thing to ask of a body anyway. If you want the glamorous outdoorsman picture, this isn't it. I had half a bologna sandwich in the console, a thermos of coffee gone cold, and an odometer logbook open on the seat next to me because I still write down exact trailhead mileage by hand. Digital records can be wrong. Paper only lies if you do. And outside my truck on a remote logging road off Highway 20 near the Deschutes, somebody was making sure I knew they were there. That was the middle. To get to the beginning, you have to understand I wasn't doing anything unusual for me. I've spent enough years on back roads that I trust routine more than instinct sometimes. Before dawn, scouting for elk movement, checking drainages, watching edges where timber meets open ground, all of that was just life for me in season. I liked the quiet. I liked keeping to myself. My truck smelled like diesel, damp wool, and the peppermints I keep in the door pocket. My logbook lived in the visor. I had a fleece cap so old the tag had worn blank and a pair of gloves stiffened by years of coffee spills and weather. Those logging roads had become familiar, too familiar maybe. In the weeks leading up to that night, I noticed road signs turned backward in spots where they absolutely had not been before. Not missing. Reversed. Same posts, same signs, just flipped around, so the reflective face pointed the wrong way, or the junction marker suddenly told you nothing unless you already knew the route. That bothered me, but not enough. People mess with signs. Hunters, bored kids, drunks, whoever. I fixed one myself and kept driving. Chalked it up to nuisance stuff. There was an abandoned way station out that way where GPS service always dropped clean out. and near there I started getting this odd little burst of CB radio static in the cab even when my radio wasn't plugged in. Just a hiss and pop now and then, brief enough that I could tell myself it was interference from something else. Trucks, weather, wiring, take your pick. A pair of headlights also began showing up behind me on return drives after dusk, always several miles back. Always in stretches where the road curves just enough that you catch them and then lose them. The first night I pulled over to let them pass because I don't enjoy being tailgated on mountain roads. The lights vanished, not sped by, not turned off right where I could see, just gone. I waited a minute, then two, then got out and listened. Nothing. Next time it happened, same thing. Now, anyone who's driven enough back roads is going to have normal explanations ready. Dip in the road, side spur, somebody turning around with lights obscured by timber. I used all of those. I am a professional grade rationalizer when I want to be. Comes from age, I think. You hit a point where pride tells you you've seen enough not to get jumpy. That's the moral failure in my version of this. Not greed or cruelty, pride. The idea that experienced outdoorsmen should not scare easily. So I stayed on those routes longer than I should have, because I didn't want to be the old guy spooked by headlights and road signs. The evening it all came together, I'd parked in a turnout I used often. Not a marked one, just a widened shoulder where you could watch a cut line at first light. I logged the odometer, killed the engine, and settled in to wait. Another vehicle had been idling somewhere below me for over an hour by then. No headlights visible through the fog. I assumed another hunter was sleeping roadside. Then I tried to leave after dark and found fresh-cut trees dropped across the road behind my truck. Not stormfall, not random. Cut, deliberate. Two trunks laid into the narrow section in a way that closed it cleanly. When I got out with my flashlight and looked at the gravel, there were tire tracks showing another vehicle had parked nearby earlier. That was when the shape of it changed. Not nuisance. Not weird coincidence. Somebody had arranged the road after I parked. I got back in the truck, locked it, and that's when the metal scraping started along the tailgate. For hours I stayed there. I don't mean a dramatic action movie stand. I mean I sat in cold air with my shoulders knotting up, trying not to drink too much water because I didn't want to need to get out. Every so often there'd be a footstep in gravel beyond what I could see, then quiet, then that single tap at the driver's side window. Once I heard breathing close enough that I thought the glass would fog from the outside. But I can't swear to that. Fear does funny things with proximity. I considered starting the engine and ramming through whatever was ahead of me, but I didn't know what was in front. Steep shoulders, ditches, deadfall, another vehicle. My best odds were daylight and another witness on the road, so I waited. It felt less like patience than surrender. But there you go. At one point I actually laughed very quietly, because my cold coffee had frozen a skin across the top in the thermos cup. There I was in a truck getting circled in the fog, and my big observation was that the coffee had become pudding. The brain takes little vacations when it can't handle the main event. The footsteps kept circling beyond visibility, not constant. Enough. By dawn, the fog had thinned to that blue-gray mountain light where shapes come back slowly. I waited a little longer, then finally leaned forward to clear a patch of condensation from the windshield with my sleeve. There were muddy handprints on every window of the truck. Every one except the windshield directly in front of my seat. Side windows, rear glass, the little back quarter windows, all of them smeared with handprints, dragged and pressed across the condensation and dirt. Some low, some high, overlapping in places, as if more than one person had done it, or one person had kept moving position. But the windshield had been left clear, deliberately clear. My line of sight outward had been preserved. That landed harder than the roadblock did. Whoever was outside hadn't just wanted to scare me. They wanted me looking out. Wanted me able to see if they chose to step in front of the truck. Nobody did. When traffic finally started moving somewhere on the bigger logging routes nearby, I heard it faintly through the valley, engines carrying farther in morning cold. I waited until then to move. Drove forward first, slow, found the open route still passable, and got out by taking a longer road around. I didn't stop until I hit a place with other trucks, other people, and actual daylight on pavement. I reported the blocked road. I reported the sign reversals. I reported the vehicle that had seemed to trail me on earlier nights. I even mentioned the CB static, which made me sound half crazy, and I knew it. The response was a shrug dressed up in paperwork. Could been trespassers. Could been anti-hunter harassment. Could been kids. Could been any number of things that, when listed together, basically mean nobody knows and nobody intends to find out. Within a year, I sold most of my hunting equipment. Not all of it at once. Piece by piece, rifle went first, then optics, then the extra camp gear. People asked if I was downsizing. Sure, fine, that's one word for it. The truth is, isolation stopped feeling restorative. It started feeling like cover someone else could use better than me. I still drive at night, obviously. Life doesn't let you opt out of roads, but I check my rearview mirrors more than I ever used to. Not casually, obsessively if I'm honest. Every pair of lights that hangs back too long gets my full attention now. And I never learned whether the people on those roads were targeting hunters on purpose, or if I'd just parked in the middle of something that was already happening out there, and had not finished happening yet. Story break. The last story in this video is the one I'd have the hardest time explaining away. Story 5. I only followed the coordinate because I'd already convinced myself the weird part was over. That's the sentence I come back to, because if I had still felt properly afraid, I probably would have done the smart thing and left it alone. I was volunteering in the shelter system near Fontana Dam after a run of severe storms. Trail maintenance, condition reports, damage photos, all of it. I wasn't a full-time ranger or anything glamorous. I was there on assignment through a volunteer group, moving between shelters, documenting what needed work, and sometimes spending nights alone between crew meetups because scheduling on long trails is always a little chaotic. Before I changed careers, I studied environmental acoustics for a while. Fancy way of saying I got very interested in how sound moves through landscapes and then failed to build a life around it. I still record birdsong on hikes because old habits hang around. Little handheld recorder, foam windscreen, labeled folders. My friends make fun of me for cataloging chirps on vacation, and they're right too. But it keeps me paying attention. That whole shelter system had this wet wood rot smell after rain. Heavy mist would soak fabric almost instantly. At night, distant river noise from down below came up through the shelter floors so it felt like the boards themselves were humming. Once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. The first wrong thing I found wasn't physical danger. It was paperwork. Several shelter logbooks had pages carefully removed. Not torn out rough by bored hikers, which was my first assumption. Cleanly removed. Whole date ranges missing. And more than once the missing sections lined up across different years around the same weeks. I remember flipping through one swollen journal under a headlamp and frowning because the neighboring pages were intact. No jagged edges, just absence. It felt administrative, which somehow made it stranger. There were also identical warnings written in different handwriting in multiple shelters. Same sentence. Do not follow side markers after rain. At first, that seemed almost normal. Trail culture is full of warnings, jokes, trail names, fake wisdom, real wisdom, all of it mixed together. People repeat things. But the same exact wording in different hands across unrelated shelters got under my skin. Still, I held on to the easy explanation. Bored hikers remove pages. Mold cleanup. Repeat local advice. End of mystery. I spent those days doing ordinary work, measuring damage, photographing split rails and washed out approaches, eating tuna packets with crackers that tasted like aquarium salt, drying socks that never really dried because the mist lived in the wood. I had a yellow rain shell that made me sound like a chip bag every time I moved, and a tiny stove that left soot on the bottom of my mug no matter what I did. Each evening I wrote notes and logged shelter conditions. Each morning I recorded a few minutes of birdsong if the weather allowed. Then I started noticing older registration logs where entire groups of hikers seemed to vanish from the record after specific storm weeks. Not disappear from life, obviously. Disappear from the paperwork trail. You'd have names signed in at one shelter, a group of 4, 6, whatever, and then on the next sequence of records there was just blank space where later entries should bridge them forward. I asked a local volunteer about it. He waved it off as clerical confusion. Wet logbooks, replacement books, people signing nicknames, all that. Reasonable enough that I felt a little foolish for making a face over documents. And then something annoying and small started happening. Rain would begin almost immediately after I found another missing section. Not dramatic storms, just rain. Like the trail timing itself to shut me up. By then I was probably primed to see patterns, but it was consistent enough that I noticed. I'd find a clean gap in a journal or another repeated warning phrase, and within minutes I'd hear that first soft tapping on the shelter roof, then the mist thickening, then rain. There was a ranger explanation too, mold remediation. Some pages had been removed during cleanup projects. Different shelters, different seasons, damp paperwork, maintenance confusion, all normal. They told me that, and for a while I believed them because I wanted to. That's the false resolution part, if you need one. I remember actually feeling embarrassed, like I'd built a whole little private mystery out of damaged paperwork, and a sentence hikers liked repeating. I even laughed at myself one night while cooking ramen in the shelter, listening to the river thrum through the boards. I thought, congratulations, you came out here to report storm damage and invented a conspiracy out of mildew. Then I reviewed my recordings. I usually check them later with headphones because half the fun is catching things you missed while standing there. One recording had wood thrush, dripping canopy, distant river. Another had chickadees, zipper noise from my jacket, a faint cough that I assumed was mine. Then on one file, very low under the bird song, there were human voices, not conversation. Repetition. Trail coordinates. I turned the volume up, cleaned the audio as best I could with the little software I use, and there it was. Faint calm. More than one voice, maybe, or one voice doubled by the landscape. Coordinates repeated in this low, almost instructional tone. I hadn't heard any people near me while recording. I am sure of that. I would noted it. That's what the recorder was for. One coordinate matched a washed-out unofficial spur trail I'd seen mentioned in maintenance notes. I should have taken that straight to somebody else. Instead, I waited until dawn and followed it. Curiosity mattered more to me in that moment than basic safety. That's the ugly truth. I had warnings in logbooks, a weird audio file, and enough common sense to know isolated side trails after rain are a bad idea. I went anyway, because I wanted the story to resolve into something understandable with my own eyes. The spur was half erased by runoff, just enough tread left to suggest people still used it. Mist soaked my pants immediately from the brush. Everything smelled like wet leaves and rot. The river noise faded and came back depending on the slope, like breathing. I almost turned around twice. Then I found the first backpack under a camouflage tarp, then another, then dozens, not neatly lined up. Piled, stashed, wedged under flood debris and brush as if the hillside itself had tried to swallow them. Backpacks, journals, clothing, odds and ends. Burned trail logbooks, stripped ID cards. Some cards had been cut or peeled from wallets and tossed aside separately. It wasn't one event's worth of things. It was accumulation. For 1 second, and this is the part that makes me feel stupid now, I thought maybe I'd found some bizarre lost and found dump. Like maybe confiscated abandoned gear had been hidden here for collection. That lasted maybe one breath. Then I saw how deliberate the damage was. Journals burned, not destroyed fully. Backpacks emptied selectively. ID cards cut precisely through the faces while leaving names readable. Not random vandalism method. The real peak came a second later when I knelt down and started seeing dates. Recent medication bottles still inside one pack. Unexpired permits in another. Not relics. Not forgotten old gear from some closed case. Recent enough that somebody could have been looking for these people still, or would be. My stomach dropped so fast I had to sit back on my heels. My hands had gone clumsy. I remember reaching automatically for my recorder, then stopping because the idea of preserving the sound in that place suddenly made me feel sick. I took photographs instead. Fast, wide shots, close shots, permit tags, the cut ID cards, the tarp setup. I did not investigate deeper into the nearby woods, even though I could see there were more traces farther in. Another tarp line, maybe. Maybe just shadow. That was where the last of my curiosity finally got overruled by survival. I backed out, then turned and hiked hard for the main trail. Every side marker I passed looked accusatory after that. Every damp blaze on a tree felt like a direction given by the wrong person. I kept expecting a voice behind me or another coordinate repeated out of the mist or someone stepping onto the trail from uphill. None of that happened. The woods stayed ordinary in the most insulting way possible. Back at a place with people, I reported everything. And then came the awful blur that always follows findings like that. Authorities, statements, questions, controlled faces, requests for copies of the photographs. I handed it all over. Some of what happened after became official. Some of it went quiet in ways I still don't trust. I was told not to speculate. Fine. I don't actually need to speculate to know what I saw. The field recordings were what finally broke me. I deleted years of them afterward. Not just that week, years, birds, streams, wind, all of it. Because once I'd heard those faint coordinate repetitions in the background, I started hearing the possibility of them everywhere. In static, in water, in crowded rooms even. My own brain was becoming a bad trail. I don't volunteer on isolated trail systems anymore. And what stays with me most isn't even the size of the hidden cache. It's the motive I still can't place. If somebody wanted those hikers gone without trace, why preserve enough of their belongings that the disappearances would eventually be noticed? Why cut the faces from the ID cards and leave the names? Why remove identity in one way while protecting it in another? That's the part that never stopped feeling wrong.